My brother walked into the lawyer's office on a Monday morning with a folder of documents he had spent 3 weeks assembling in the particular confidence of a man who has already decided how a situation ends before it officially begins. He sat down across from my grandfather's attorney, placed the folder on the table with the deliberate precision of someone making a statement rather than starting a conversation, and said that he was the sole intended beneficiary of the estate, that the will on record was not the final version of my grandfather's wishes, and that he had documentation to support everything he was claiming. The attorney listened. I listened. And for approximately 40 minutes, my brother's version of events was the only version in the room, and it was detailed and confident and supported by paperwork that looked, on the surface, exactly like what he said it was. Then the attorney's assistant knocked on the door and handed him a USB drive, and the attorney plugged it into his laptop, and we watched a video that my grandfather had recorded 14 months before he died, in his own living room, in his own chair, in his own voice, saying everything he had, apparently, decided needed to be said on camera rather than only on paper. My brother's folder sat on the table untouched for the rest of the meeting. Stay with me, because what my grandfather said on that video, and why he had recorded it without telling either of us, is the most deliberate act of quiet foresight I have ever witnessed. And what it revealed about my brother is something my brother had been counting on nobody ever finding out. If you've ever had someone try to take what was yours while you were standing right there, subscribe right now, because this story is about to show you what happens when the person who loved you most thought ahead far enough to make sure that couldn't work. I need to take you back before the folder and the video and the lawyer's office, because none of it makes sense without the 20 years that built up to it. My brother's name is Nathan, and for most of those 20 years he had been, by conventional measures, the more successful of the two of us. Better job title, better address, more visible markers of the kind of achievement that reads clearly at family gatherings. I worked as a landscape architect, doing work I loved and that paid adequately, and that Nathan had described more than once as admirable in the tone people use when they mean modest. Nathan worked in finance, in the specific sector of finance that generates the kind of income that allows a person to develop a particular relationship with money, which is the relationship of someone who has had enough of it long enough to start believing that having it was the natural result of being the right kind of person. Our grandfather, whose name was Frank, had never been impressed by Nathan's money in the way Nathan wanted him to be. This was a source of friction that Nathan managed carefully, never letting it surface completely, never letting my grandfather see how much the absence of that specific admiration bothered him, but present underneath every interaction in the specific way that things are present when they are felt but not said. My grandfather was a man who evaluated people by what they gave rather than what they had, and Nathan gave in carefully measured amounts, and my grandfather, who had been reading people for 81 years, had taken his measure accurately. I had a different relationship with my grandfather, built on different currency. I spent time with him, real time, present time, the kind that costs something from your actual life rather than from your calendar's margin. I drove 40 minutes every other weekend to sit with him after my grandmother died, and he was alone in the house they had shared for 48 years. I helped him maintain the garden, not because I was hired to or asked to or hoping for anything from it, but because I was a landscape architect who loved plants, and he was a man whose garden had been his wife's and who wanted it kept the way she had kept it. And I understood both those things and had the specific skills to honor them. We talked during those visits in the real way, the way that requires something from both people, and what I knew about my grandfather by the end of those years was the kind of knowledge that only comes from consistent, genuine attention. Nathan visited on major holidays and my grandfather's birthday. He always brought something expensive. My grandfather always thanked him graciously and put the expensive thing somewhere and continued the conversation about whatever he had actually been interested in, which was rarely the expensive thing. When my grandfather got sick, I managed his care, not because I was assigned to, not because it was formally decided, because I was the one who showed up when the hospital called, the one who coordinated with the doctors, the one who sat in the appointments and asked the questions that needed asking and took notes and followed up. Nathan came twice during the 8 months of my grandfather's decline, both times for less than a day, both times leaving with the slightly relieved energy of someone who has discharged an obligation and can now return to their regular life. My grandfather died in March, and the formal reading was scheduled for 3 weeks after the funeral. And in those 3 weeks, something happened that I did not know about until I was sitting in that lawyer's office watching Nathan put his folder on the table. Nathan had used those 3 weeks productively. He had located a version of my grandfather's will, an earlier draft, predating the most recent one by 4 years, and had done something with it that I am going to describe as carefully as the truth allows, which is that he had submitted it to the attorney as the operative document while representing the more recent, official version as something my grandfather had executed under conditions that called its validity into question. He had paperwork suggesting my grandfather, as cognitive state in the period when the final will was signed, had been compromised. Doctors' notes that I later learned were selectively excerpted from records that, in full, said something considerably different. If you're sitting with the specific, airless feeling of someone watching a person they grew up with reveal something about themselves they wish they hadn't seen, comment I know that feeling below, because what Nathan had built in 3 weeks was the most methodical thing I had ever seen him do, and the fact that he had applied that methodical energy to this particular project told me something about him that I was not going to be able to unknow. The attorney, a man named Mr. Graves, who had handled my grandfather's affairs for 16 years and had the specific composure of someone who has seen most of what people do in rooms like this one, listened to Nathan's presentation with the careful attention of a professional doing his job correctly. He asked questions. He reviewed documents. And then his assistant knocked on the door. Mr. Graves plugged the USB drive in and angled the laptop so both Nathan and I could see the screen, and my grandfather's face appeared, and the room became a completely different room than it had been 60 seconds earlier. My grandfather was sitting in his chair by the window, the one he always sat in, with the garden visible behind him, my grandmother's garden, the one I had maintained for 3 years. He looked directly at the camera with the specific, unhurried directness of a man who has decided what he wants to say and is not going to be hurried through it. He stated his full name, the date, 14 months before his death, and then said he was recording this video because he had become aware that the contents of his estate might be subject to dispute after his death, and that he wanted to provide a clear, contemporaneous record of his intentions, his reasoning, and his cognitive state, which he noted was entirely intact and which he invited anyone watching to assess for themselves. He spoke for 22 minutes. I am going to tell you the most important parts because he earned the telling. He said that his estate was to be divided as specified in the will, dated 14 months prior, which he described in enough detail to make the document unambiguous. He said he had made the allocations he had made not on the basis of who needed the money most. Nathan needed it least of anyone in the family, but on the basis of what he had observed across 81 years of watching people, and specifically across the last decade of watching his 2 grandchildren. He said that one of his grandchildren had shown up, and one had not, and that showing up was the only metric that had ever mattered to him, and that he was not going to apologize for valuing it. He said these things without bitterness, in the plain, settled voice of a man who had already made peace with every part of what he was saying. Then he looked directly into the camera and said, "If this video is being watched, it is because someone has disputed the will. I anticipated this possibility, which is why I'm recording. I want to say clearly, for whatever record this becomes, that my wishes are exactly what I wrote down, that I wrote them down with full understanding of what I was doing and why, and that anyone who tells you differently is not telling you the truth." He paused, and then said, "I love both my grandsons, but love and inheritance are not the same accounting system, and I have never believed they should be. Nathan did not look at the screen for the last 4 minutes of the video. He looked at the table, at the folder he had assembled at his own hands. The folder, which had seemed so substantial 40 minutes earlier, looked different now, not because its contents had changed, but because the context for them had, completely and permanently. Mr. Graves stopped the video and closed the laptop and looked at Nathan with the specific, neutral professionalism of a man who has seen the resolution of a situation and is now simply administering it. What followed was not dramatic. No shouting, no confrontation, no scene. Nathan asked 2 questions about the legal implications of the video, received 2 answers, and then sat in silence for a moment, and then said he needed to speak with his own attorney before proceeding. Mr. Graves said he was welcome to do so and that the estate administration would continue. In the meantime, according to the operative will, Nathan picked up his folder and left the room. He didn't look at me. I didn't try to make him. I sat in that office for a few minutes after he left, with Mr. Graves, who had the grace to give me the quiet I needed before beginning the administrative conversation about next steps. I thought about my grandfather in that chair by the window, looking at the camera 14 months before he died, saying the things he had decided needed to be said out loud and on record, because he had known, with the clear-eyed knowledge of a man who had been reading people for 8 decades, that someone was going to try to revise his wishes after he was gone. He had known, and he had sat down in his chair with a camera and done the thing that would prevent it, without telling either of us, with the patient. Quiet competence that had characterized everything he did that actually mattered. Nathan did not contest the estate. His attorney, I was told secondhand, reviewed the video and advised him clearly enough that the conversation was brief. I don't know the specifics of that conversation, and I am not going to speculate, because what happened between Nathan and his lawyer is Nathan's story and not mine. What I know is that the administration proceeded as my grandfather intended, and that I received what he had left me, and that what he had left me was not simply money or property, but the specific, overwhelming knowledge that he had seen me clearly, enough and valued what he saw, enough to protect it before he was gone. Nathan and I have not spoken since that morning in Mr. Graves's office. I am not going to tell you I have fully resolved how I feel about that, because I haven't. The specific grief of learning that someone you grew up with was willing to do what Nathan did is not something that resolves cleanly or quickly, and I am not going to perform a resolution I haven't reached just because the story feels like it needs one. What I will tell you is that I have stopped expecting the resolution to arrive on any particular schedule, and that in the meantime I am building something with what my grandfather left me, something in the neighborhood his house is in, something involving the kind of work I have always done, something that will be visible and real and rooted in the place he spent his life. The garden is still going. I still maintain it, even though the house will eventually be part of the estate's resolution, because the garden was my grandmother's and my grandfather loved it, and letting it go without reason would feel like a small, but real betrayal of something I'm not willing to betray. I go on weekends, the same weekends I always went, and I work in the quiet that those mornings have always had. And sometimes I sit in the chair by the window, his chair, and look at what I've kept alive. And I think about a man who trusted me enough to build a protection I didn't know I needed, and I try to be the person he recorded himself describing. If this story hit something real in you, if you've ever had someone try to take what was yours, or been protected by someone who saw it coming before you did, tell me in the comments which moment hit hardest. Nathan's folder on the table, my grandfather's face on the screen, or the garden on weekend mornings. I read every single one. Subscribe now for more raw, real, unforgettable stories about the people who loved us carefully enough to protect us from the ones who didn't. Hit that notification bell so you never miss the next story, and stay close, because what I'm bringing you next is even more powerful than this, and you do not want to miss a single word.